Well, these two friends, they were standing there together at the edge. They were looking down and hesitating. At least one of them was. You see, these two friends had decided to go skydiving together. Now, one of them was very experienced, and in fact, they were going to do a tandem jump together. But the other guy had never done it before. And at this point, he was having second thoughts. They had paid their money, they had done the prep work, they were there, and they were looking over the edge. And he was frozen. But the experienced friend says to him, "Don't worry, it'll be fine. Do you trust me?" He says, "I'll be with you the whole time. Do you trust me?" Now, I don't know if I would trust that guy. But that is the question. And that is the issue at hand. Trust. When we face hardships, do we trust God, who is with us all the time, who will be with us through it all? Do we trust God? When the pressure is on, do we lean on God? And even if you are challenged because of your faith, do you respond in faith and trust God? Today we're going to talk about faith endurance. Enduring through trials. And the good that comes as a result of trials. And how we can face those trials in faith. So we begin in James chapter 1 and verse 1. And he writes, "James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings." Now, this book was written by James. And it was written around the same time as Galatians, which we just finished looking at. The book of James is a very practical book talking about how you live as a follower of Jesus. But here he says that in his greeting, he writes it to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, or the 12 tribes, which is a reference to Israel, the 12 tribes who are scattered or dispersed. Now, this word dispersion is a technical term referring specifically to Jews who are scattered around the world outside of the land of Israel. Now, we could talk about Jews of dispersion in the first hand as those who were outside of Israel because of the exile. You know, in the Old Testament, when the Jews disobeyed God and he sent in the Assyrians and the Babylonians to come in and take them out of their land. And now they're spread out throughout the world. Those would be Jews of dispersion. But then, as time goes on, we talk about the Jewish Christians who are spread out throughout the world for one reason or another. But in fact, if you read in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 11, verse 9, it speaks of these Jews, and it says this, "Of those who are scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen." So, this is who James is writing to. These Jewish Christians, believers, who have been scattered as a result of the persecution that arose around the time of Stephen. They were scattered because of this persecution, but the interesting thing, their lives are still hard. Now, life was hard for followers of Jesus in Israel, especially in Jerusalem. The other Jews didn't like them because they believed in Jesus, that Jesus was the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. The Jews didn't like what they taught and what they stood for. And these Christians were often mistreated, and some, like Stephen, were killed. And they had a hard time just making a living there because the Jews didn't want to buy or sell with them either, just to make life harder. And so many of those Jewish Christians left. They left Jerusalem. They left Israel. they moved away, and now, wherever they are, scattered around, they are still having hard times. And so James is writing to them. But before we move on from this first verse, I want you to notice how James refers to himself. Now, James could have said, from James, the brother of Jesus, or half-brother of Jesus, because that's who he was. He could have said, from James, the leader or a leader in the church in Jerusalem. These things were true of him, and these could have been the things that he said. And you can imagine saying, I'm the brother of Jesus. People might go, oh, I should listen to you. If you said, I'm a leader in the church in Jerusalem, people might say, hey, that gives you authority. I should listen to you. James doesn't even mention those things. They're true, but he makes no mention of them. Why? Because the thing that was significant for life and the thing that qualified him to write this letter wasn't his physical relationship with Jesus, but his spiritual relationship with Jesus. Jesus is his Lord, his master. So how does James introduce himself? As a servant of God and of Jesus. Now, I think we read over that word servant and we miss the gravity of it. And there's a couple reasons. One, we're used to hearing it. We're used to reading it. If we've been around the Bible, we hear that, oh, you're the servant of God or the servant of Jesus. And we just read it as, okay, he's someone who serves God. The second reason is because the word servant is kind of sanitized in that this Greek word could also be translated as slave. But we hear servant and we think, oh, not so bad a slave. Because we hear servant and what do we think of? We think of a butler or a maid. Someone who's working for someone, serving someone, but they're just getting paid and they could quit at any time. That's not what this word is referring to. When we hear that servant, we don't think slave. But the Greek word here means slave. It refers to someone who is bound to his master and who is bound to his master's will. Someone who is completely controlled by his master. So James says, I am the slave of God and of Jesus. And when he says this, when he introduces himself this way, it is a statement of complete devotion to God and to Jesus. He is saying that his will is consumed by the will of God and Jesus. In other words, I want to do what he wants. You see, calling himself a servant of God and of Jesus is both a statement of humility and of honor. It's a statement of humility because he is submitting to God's will. But he also has the honor of belonging to God, of belonging to Jesus, and of being used by God for his purposes. That's an honor. But the entire letter of James is flavored by this fact that he is a slave or a servant of Jesus. And that we belong to God and to Jesus. And so we're to live that out. Now think about that for a minute. What does it mean to live as a servant or a slave of Christ? Is my will my desires, what I choose to do, my will, consumed with his. In other words, do I want what he wants? Now, if that was totally true of you, how would it change the way you live? That is a question that you can and should ponder for the rest of your life. Is my will consumed by yours? And if it is, how does that affect the way I live? Well, that was just the greeting. We'll move on. We could have stayed there, but I think that in itself is convicting enough. But we will move on. And now James will tell us that trials can be good. Look at verse 2. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Now, the word trials can refer to trials as in testing, or it can refer to temptation to sin. And sometimes when you have this word used, it could refer to both of those ideas. But the specific meaning of the word depends on its context. In other words, how do you read it now and how do you read it there? It depends on the context, what is being said around it. Here it refers to trials or testing or hardships. And that becomes clear from verses 3 and 4. But James tells us that there are many different kinds of trials. There are many different kinds of hardships that we can suffer. And James will allude to some of those later on in his letter. Things like being very poor, being sick, being slandered, being mistreated, being taken advantage of. But I want you to notice that James doesn't say, if you experience trials. What does he say? When. He says, count it all joy when you experience these various trials. That means you can expect it to happen. You can expect there to be trials and hardships in your life. This is not just a hypothetical situation, but he assumes that you will face hardships at one time or another, and maybe many times. So he says, when you suffer, or maybe it's better, whenever you suffer, because it may be repeated, whenever you suffer, this is the right response. Now, what is the response? He says, count it all joy. Now, those words, all joy, are the first words in the Greek sentence, and they're put first in the sentence in order to emphasize it. All joy! But think about that for a minute. Joy, rejoicing, this is the opposite response of most people to hardships. And it seems very unnatural to say, oh, this is hard, I have joy. It seems very unnatural, and it actually seems like a surprising command. So James emphasizes it and puts it right there at the front. All joy. I really mean this. All joy. Rejoicing, joy and rejoicing is the focus of this sentence. Believers are to count or consider it real or true joy when they encounter hardships. Now, when James says this isn't just positive thinking. This isn't just empty sentiment. Like, well, just be happy. I know it's hard, but smile. Put on a happy face. That's not what James is talking about here. And he's not saying to be excited about suffering like, yes, I get to hurt. He's not saying go look for pain. And he's not saying to pretend that hardships aren't real, that they're not hard, or deny that you're sad, deny that you're suffering. He's not telling you to pretend. But what he's saying is that when we suffer hardships and trials, we recognize that even in the midst of it, we have real reason to rejoice. But what is that reason? That's what it tells us in the next verses. Look at verse 3 and 4. It says, "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So why rejoice when you're going through trials? Why? Well, because of the end result that will come from those trials. The end result that those trials will have in our lives, assuming that we are faithful to God through those trials. You see, these trials test our faith. These trials are an external circumstance from God, or that God allows in your life, that give you the opportunity to exercise faith and to stretch your faith and to grow in faith. He says that this is a testing. And this testing here, it refers to a refining process that strengthens or purifies something and proves or gives evidence of the fact that it's genuine. It's like refining gold. What do you do to refine gold? Well, they take all the gold ore, all the stuff they've dug, and they put it in a pot and they heat it up. They turn on the fire and it melts it. And all the stuff, all the impurities, all the stuff that is not gold comes to the top, and they scoop it off and they get rid of it. And what's left is pure gold, true gold, all gold. So when James is writing here, he assumes that his reader's faith is genuine, and that the experience of testing by the trials will demonstrate that their faith is genuine. But the emphasis here is more on the actual purifying or strengthening of faith. He says this testing produces steadfastness or endurance. The Greek word that is translated here as steadfastness or endurance is made up of two words. And those two words are this: remain under. And this gives us a good picture of what he means by enduring. Remain under. The idea is holding up as long as you can, long term, under a great weight. You're remaining under the weight. You're enduring it. And so if you're holding something and you're staying there, you are staying there holding it up and being able to continue to remain even though that weight is on you. And so you are enduring through these trials. So when you're under pressure from some trial and some hardship, you can exercise faith and persevere under it. Faith gives us staying power to endure through hardships. And then he says that enduring under pressure by faith, it actually affects your life. It grows you up. When you go through that hard time and you endure by faith, it causes you to grow up. The end goal is to become mature or perfect and complete. In other words, the goal is that you're going to get to a place where you have it together and you're faithfully following Jesus and you obey God. Now, of course, we know that this is a lifelong process. And we will not be fully perfect, fully complete until the day we stand before Jesus. But this is a lifelong process. So every trial is an opportunity to grow and to become more mature. It's kind of like weight training. I don't know if any of you are weightlifters out there, but when you lift weights, weightlifters, they repeatedly lift heavy weights. They hold those weights up above their heads or wherever, whatever motion they're taking. But they repeatedly stress the muscles. They repeatedly put this weight on the muscles. They're putting the muscles through trials. And they endure under that weight. And what happens when people are lifting weights is those muscles actually, when they stress, they actually tear. And when those little tears heal, they heal back stronger. And that's how you build muscle. That is a great picture of what we're talking about here. Those trials that come and you're under that stress and you endure under that stress, and it may cause little tears, but you grow back stronger. It heals stronger. God uses those trials to make you stronger. So that is the process here. And that is why we can have real joy. When we suffer hardships, we can endure, and we are going through that experience. And when we hang in there by faith, it causes us to grow and to become more like Jesus. Now notice there in verse 4 that there was a command. He said, let steadfastness have its full effect. He doesn't just say steadfastness has its full effect. He says, let. This is a command. In other words, you have to let it work in your heart. You have to respond well to the situation. So when you experience a trial, you respond to that trial by trusting in God and enduring. And then as you endure, you see it as an opportunity to grow, and you let it change you. You say, what am I learning from this? You let it change you, and you let it work in you, and you will mature. The problem is oftentimes people's response to trials is to complain and run away. I don't want to deal with this. And so we complain about it, and then we run away. The pressure comes, the hardship's there, I don't like this, and I run away. But that hardship may be a refining fire that God is using to strengthen your faith. A refining fire that God is using to strengthen your Christ-like character. And if you just complain and run away, you won't grow. You won't be refined. So exercise faith by trusting in God and leaning on God for strength and persevere. And let me make just one specific application to this idea. In America, more and more so lately, we complain about our religious liberties being taken away. And it's a bad thing, don't get me wrong. But is this trial, this loss of liberties, or this infringing on our Christian rights, our religious rights, is this trial doing more than just giving you something to complain about? Is it growing your faith? Is it moving you to serve God? Is it moving you to be more like Jesus? Now, all this we've been talking about this morning can be very hard to do. Rejoice in trials. Endure through hardships. I don't even want to have a hardship, but endure through it. How can we do this? Well, before we look at the next verse, I'm going to give you one answer that we saw in Galatians. Walk by the Spirit. Walk by the Spirit. Listen to God's Spirit and submit to Him as He leads you. When the hardship comes, I think a lot of times we just, like I said, we complain or we talk. We need to stop talking and listen. Listen to God. Listen to His Spirit, because He will lead you. But again, that may be hard to do. So how do we do it? Well, James gives us a very simple and direct instruction. Look at verse 5. He says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. He says, if you lack wisdom, simple answer, ask God. That's the answer. If you lack wisdom, ask God. So we just saw that our goal in all of this was to be mature, and James uses the phrase, lacking in nothing. But then he immediately comes and says, but if you're lacking something, wisdom, he knows we're not there yet. He knows that we are not totally mature, lacking in nothing. And so he says, so if you're lacking, one thing that you may be lacking is wisdom or insight. Knowing how life works. Knowing how to deal with life and how to deal with these hardships that you're going through. The thing is, wisdom is important for life. If you read through the Proverbs and through Psalms, you'll see many statements about wisdom and how important it is. And you will see that wisdom leads people to live for God. And wisdom leads people to know how to live well. And so James says, you may be lacking in wisdom. And you may be lacking in wisdom in general or specifically in reference to facing hardships. And that's the context right here. And so understanding how to stand up under trials by faith. And if you're lacking that wisdom, if you don't know, ask God. So you don't know how to make it through that hardship. You don't know how to make it through that trial. You don't know what to do, or you don't know how to keep going. I just can't keep doing it. Ask God. How can I make it through? Ask God. And this isn't just a good idea. As James writes it here, it's a command. It's the right thing to do. When you find yourself at a loss and you don't know what to do, ask God. You need wisdom? Ask God. And James says, don't be afraid to ask, because God is generous and He gives sincerely and without reservation. You see, He loves you and He loves to give wisdom. So don't feel bad about asking for it. He wants to give you all that you need in order to live for Him. And James says He also gives without reproach. In other words, He doesn't criticize you. He's not going to put you down or insult you or reprimand you for needing wisdom. I can't believe you would ask for that. How do you need wisdom? He's not going to do that. He doesn't. He doesn't look down on you because you ask for wisdom. Have you ever asked someone for help, and as they come to help you, the entire time they berate you and say, I can't believe you needed my help. You should know how to do this. And it makes you feel about... He says, that's not God. He's happy to give you wisdom. Ask for it. But he says there's a right way to ask. So he tells us that now. Verse 6 to 8. He says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded, unstable in all his ways. So how do we ask God for wisdom? Or how do we ask God for anything for that matter? Well, in faith. Believing in God and trusting Him. And this makes sense. If we're going to ask God, we need to trust that He will do and can do. Hebrews 11:6 says this, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. You see, if we are asking God for wisdom to help us in trials, we have to believe that He is God. And we have to believe that He can do what is needed and that He will do what He has said He will do. So James says, you ask in faith, trusting God. Now, the opposite of faith is doubting. And the person who doubts is full of indecision and hesitation. The person who's this doubter is always moving back and forth with different thoughts and different ideas. So every time a new thought, new idea comes on, he goes, oh, that looks good, that sounds good. I don't know what to believe. He's not sure what he believes. James describes him like the water that is of the sea that is constantly moving, meaning it's constantly changing shape. So as the swells of the water move through the surface of the water, it's never the same. It's always different. Or as the wind starts blowing hard on the water and it gets choppy and the waves are kind of stirring around and there's just constant churning. He says that's what that guy's like. There's this constant churning. He's unstable. There's nothing firm. There's nothing certain in his mind. But he's driven about by every idea or feeling that comes along. And so the doubter is not trusting God. He's not believing God. But he also says the doubter, he's double-minded. In other words, he's divided. He's arguing with himself. This makes me think of when I was a kid, the cartoons of the two-headed giant. You know, who there's two heads and they want to do different things. You know, but you know, this guy wants to be nice and this guy wants to be mean or whatever, and they're being pulled. This is the double-minded guy. He has two heads, two ideas. Let me go here. No, let me go here. And he's constantly fighting with himself, arguing with himself. He doesn't know what he believes. He has no sure footing because he's not sure where to put his feet. And his heart is torn. And so he isn't fully devoted to God. There's an Old Testament person I think of who's an example of this unstable, double-minded man. And that's King Saul. Remember King Saul? Sometimes he believed God. Sometimes he trusted God. Sometimes he was obedient to God. And just as often it seems, he didn't believe God. He didn't trust God. He didn't obey God. Well, I want to do what's right. The people say, hey, do this. Okay. Someone who was divided. Someone who was constantly torn. And how did his life end? Not well. But James says that this conflicted person shouldn't expect God to give him anything. Then again, he isn't really expecting God to do anything for him. He doesn't believe. He doesn't sure. He's not trusting. He's not believing. Now, this isn't to suggest that if you have any little doubt or any little lapse of faith or any uncertainty that comes along, that you're double-minded. Because that would mean we are all that double-minded man. Because none of us is perfect. Even Abraham, who, if you remember in Galatians, talked about him as like the father of faith, the father of those who believe. Abraham had some pretty major lapses in faith, right? And so, this is, when James is saying this, he's contrasting between a person who generally lives in consistent doubt versus a person who generally lives with consistent belief. That means there may be moments of weakness, but the person has an undivided heart that is fully committed to God, that believes in God and trusts God. Now, a conflicted, double-minded life like this, though, is a terrible life to live. It's like having one foot on stable ground and one foot on moving ground. In Dallas, there's a place called the Reunion Tower. It's a large tower, and at the top of the tower, there's a restaurant. And you take this elevator up to the restaurant, and if you have a lot of money to spend, you take this elevator up to the restaurant, and as you walk in, the center of the restaurant is stable. But the outside of the restaurant, it's a circle, and it spins, it rotates. So as you sit there, in an hour, you will see the entire city, all 360 degrees from where you're at. But I'm telling you, when you walk from that center section that isn't moving to the part that is moving, even though it's not moving that fast, it's very unsettling. Because you're going from still to... This is what I think of the unstable person. They're trying to live like this. And I've seen people who live like this, who are constantly going back and forth, constantly wavering, living as if they're not sure what to believe. Never sure where to go, never sure what to do. And all of life becomes a struggle. And I simply want to say, if that's you, stop. Believe in Jesus and follow him. Go to Jesus. Believe in him and follow him. But back to the main point of our passage. How can we rejoice when we are faced with trials? When we face those trials and we endure by faith, how can we do that? Well, the answer is by faith. By believing in God, trusting in God. And if I don't know how to get through it, ask God. And there's one thing I've noticed in my life. Sometimes the wisdom that we receive from God is not as simple, this is how you do it. In fact, a lot of times it may not be just a clear, okay, here's the answer, do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. So I may not now perfectly understand how to deal with the problem that is in front of me. But the wisdom that I get is that I know that God is with me and will get me through it. You see, the wisest thing I have ever learned is to stay close to God, no matter what you're going through. The answer is to keep seeking God. That's wisdom. Keep seeking God and keep holding on to God. Trials push us to walk by the Spirit. They remind us and teach us to live by faith. And when we face trials, It's like God asking us, do you trust me? I'll be with you through the whole thing. Do you trust me? Are you leaning on me? Every trial is another opportunity for God to show himself mighty in delivering, and an opportunity for you and I to grow in our faith, to increase your faith endurance. So even though I'm not having fun, we can endure and we can rejoice even when we are suffering hardships, because God is using that trial to grow you and to make you mature and complete.